Hello and welcome to the Vineyard Underground podcast. This is your host and viticulturist, Fritz Westover, and I'm joined today by my good pal, Jim Duane from the Inside Winemaking podcast. And we're going to be answering your grape growing questions together in today's episode. So this is going to be a super fun episode. Hey, Jim, I'm excited to do this episode with you and answer all these great questions that have been asked by the Inside Winemaking podcast listeners.
Thanks, Fritz. I'm very excited to be here. I'm really looking forward to this collaboration. I've gathered a bunch of great questions, some hard questions that I wasn't comfortable answering. So super excited to have you and your expertise.
Yeah, this will be a good collaboration because when I have winemaking questions, I need a place to go too. So we might have to reciprocate that with my community someday. So, but before we do, let's just talk a little bit about yourself and what you do and how you got into wine as a career and into podcasting about wine.
Sure, you bet. So I live and work in Napa Valley, where I've been for about the past 20 years. But I didn't grow up here. I grew up actually in Salt Lake City, Utah. First worked at a vineyard growing some Civol Blanc back in the late 90s. One thing I did was figure out young, just kind of as I was coming out of high school, going into college, that I wanted to make wine. Kind of joke was like the easiest way to get beer in Salt Lake City when you're a teenager is make your own. So that's kind of what started me into fermentation. But I've always been a plant guy. I've always been that kid on the soccer field that was more interested in the dandelions and the grass than the sport or anything that was going on. So I always knew that I needed to work outside with plants, and kind of like those two things came together and really pointed me towards winemaking. I was very fortunate to figure that out when I was young. Our first question comes from a grower who has a vineyard in Italy. His vineyard is in the Le Marche region, which is known for its Verdecchio white wine. And he says, I have a vineyard that is in good health overall and is now about 30 years old. Several hundred of the vines, out of the 8,000-ish total, have died gradually over the years. I don't want to replant the whole vineyard or sections or whole sections of it, as I want to make wine from the older vines. So I need to replace only the dead vines, which are interspersed randomly throughout. So what are the main considerations for this task? How long might it take to prep the ground and replant each replacement vine? And can I also use this opportunity to slowly increase the planting density? Currently, he's at about 1.5 meters between vines by simply putting 3 new vines in where 2 have died next to each other or something similar. So a couple of questions there. What do you think, Fritz?
Yeah, no, it's a lot of questions. It's kind of loaded, right? You know, you got this
Yeah.
that's 30 years old. And yes, I'm jealous it's in Italy, but maybe this is our ticket to go and visit. I think what we have to do, Jim, is create a site visit where we go and actually help your grower firsthand, right? So
I'd love that.
no, let's do that together. But since we can't do that right now, let's just try and help them from a distance the best we can. So, the first question I would want to ask, if the vineyard's in good health overall, why are some of these vines declining? Is it, and I could probably answer the question because the most common reason, if it's not something like virus or something that was just in the vine 30 years ago, obviously we didn't have clean plant material and certification programs that long ago. It's probably some form of damage to the vine. It could be, years of poor pruning that caused some dieback. It could be pruning wounds that were infected by trunk diseases. And some vines just were lucky enough not to get those diseases, or maybe they're able to live better with those grapevine trunk diseases. But usually it's a combination of things: pruning wounds that were done improperly, and then maybe some diseases that got into the pruning wounds. And, the list goes on and on. But we're not here to try and be detectives and figure out why these vines are failing randomly in the vineyard. We're going to answer the question of what do we do if we want to replant within the existing vineyard. So, this is kind of what I think of. I always think back to when you develop a new site. What are the things you need to make sure you're doing? If you're going to be planting a grapevine, you need to test your soil, make sure you've got all the mineral nutrition, right? So do a soil test in general in the areas where you're replanting. I would actually go to the sites and the spots where the replant vines are going to be put and do a compilation of samples, put them together, send them to a lab. Make sure you're sampling down to 12, 15 inches because your roots are going to be planted at that depth when you're planting a new vineyard. And then, think back to when you developed your vineyard, what amendments were done then? So if your soil is acidic and you need to add lime, you need to incorporate it into the soil. So you're going to need to do some digging and incorporation of certain things. If you need phosphorus, that needs to be put into the soil and it needs to be incorporated because it doesn't move with water in that mass flow.
Next one's about planting grapevines. And the grower asks, how important is it to break through hardpan? Where I'm planning on planting, I have a hardpan 2 to 3 feet down. Do I need to use an auger to punch through that? Or is that deep enough for the vine to not have wet feet that becomes problematic?
Okay, this is a pretty cool question. So let me first just clarify what we're talking about when we say hardpan for the listener who may not be familiar with the term. Uh, Hardpan is basically some type of layer in the soil that's impeding either water movement through it, and that seems to be the concern with this grower because they're worried about wet feet. So they're thinking water is accumulating on this hardpan. So is it a rock hardpan? Is it a layer of clay? Is there something about the layer in the soil that has been compacted from farm equipment running over it for years or whatever it is? If that's the case, and water is really accumulating there, and your grapevine roots are going to be sitting in water, that usually is not a good thing for lots of reasons. But vines, as we know, just don't like wet feet. So will going through with an auger and puncturing holes here and there really alleviate the problem? I don't think so, because I think you're really just hitting too small of an area with that. It's kind of like poking a little hole in the top of a shade sail that's accumulating water. It's probably going to break the shade sail with the weight of the water before that little hole is going to drain enough water to stop the incident from occurring. So, and when you look into soil ripping or really deep cultivation, going below 3 feet is really not that common. Most ripping is happening down to 2 or 3 feet at the most. But I mean, I know some growers get out there with big equipment, D9s or whatever, and they're really going down 4 or 5 or 6 feet. That's expensive to do. So what I would ask this grower is, do you already have some slope? And slope's really important here, because even if you do have a hard pan, if it's 3 feet down and you have slope, as that water percolates through your well-drained soil and hits that hard pan or impermeable layer, if you have slope, it will continue to move downhill and away from the vines, but it's going to be moving underground. So it's going to be slower. So if you're in an area where you don't have heavy rainfall, you're probably less likely to see an issue during the season if you can control the irrigation and control the amount of water. But if you have a lot of water during the season and rain, that can be done. So I guess what I'm saying, let me just talk from experience. I've worked with a few extreme examples, and mostly these are in the Texas Hill Country in Arizona, that used a 4-foot rock saw. So it goes down it's an 8-foot saw, goes down circular, 4 feet into the ground. And they were using this to break through hard pan and rock shelve that was basically impeding water movement and was also impeding the ability to put a line post in the ground to trellis in. And I'll tell you, this is like a nerve-wracking and expensive endeavor, but luckily it worked. I mean, in all 3 sites that I've done this in, it was necessary in order to plant the vineyard, and it did help. And we're seeing better drainage. We're seeing more uniformity than in areas where that process wasn't. So I would say to this grower, you are probably better off getting a soil scientist who specializes in vineyards, especially, or orchards, out to your site to really assess if that hard pan's an issue. And if they recommend ripping, you're probably going to rip at least one direction, if not 2, and breaking it up. But if you've got slope and you've got control of your water and it's 3 feet down, I'm going to guess you're probably going to be okay. I actually have vineyards I work with who don't even have 3 feet of soil, and they're doing just fine.